Let me ask you something quietly tonight. Have you ever noticed how your mind sometimes refuses to be quiet? You try to relax, but thoughts keep coming. Memories appear, worries about tomorrow, old conversations replaying again and again. For many people, the mind feels like something we should control. Yet strangely, it often feels like it has a life of its own. More than 2,500 years ago, the Buddha explored this very mystery. He discovered something simple, yet deeply liberating. Sometimes the key to peace is not controlling the mind. It is learning how to observe it. And tonight, I want to begin with a very small experiment. Part 1. The Thought Experiment. Let me begin with a small experiment. Nothing complicated, just something very simple. For the next 10 seconds, I want you to try something with me. Try not to think about a white elephant. Yes, a white elephant. Not a gray one, not a cartoon one. A very large, very bright white elephant. Just for 10 seconds. Try not to think about it. What happened? Most people smile when they hear this question. Because the moment I asked you not to think about a white elephant, your mind probably did exactly that. The image appeared. Maybe it appeared instantly. Maybe it came back again and again, and suddenly something very interesting happened. You realized that your mind does not always listen to you. Now let me ask you something gently. If those thoughts are truly yours, why can't you stop them? Think about that for a moment. We spend most of our lives saying things like, my thoughts, my mind, my worries. But if they truly belong to us, shouldn't we be able to control them? And yet many of us have had the same experience late at night. You lie in bed, the house is quiet, the lights are off, and suddenly your mind begins talking. Old memories appear. Regrets from 10 years ago, things someone said long ago, worries about tomorrow. You tell your mind, please stop. But it keeps going. Have you ever had a night like that? I have. Many people have shared this with me over the years. One gentleman once told me something that stayed with me. He said, sometimes my mind feels like a radio that never turns off. Maybe you understand that feeling. And here is where something very important begins to reveal itself. Because the moment you notice this, a quiet question appears. If the mind keeps speaking, who is the one hearing it? This question may sound simple, but it is one of the most powerful questions in the entire history of human wisdom. More than 2,500 years ago, the Buddha invited people to investigate this very mystery. Not through belief, not through philosophy, but through direct observation. He asked people to look carefully at their own experience and ask, are these thoughts truly me? Or are they simply events appearing in the mind? You see, most of us grow up believing that we are our thoughts. If a thought appears saying, I am not good enough, we believe it. If another thought says, I am angry, we believe that too. But what if thoughts are more like clouds passing through the sky? They appear, they move, and eventually they disappear. The sky does not chase the clouds. The sky does not argue with them. It simply allows them to pass. Now I want you to imagine something for a moment. Imagine sitting quietly on a porch on a rainy afternoon. You hear the rain tapping gently on the roof. Thoughts come and go in your mind the same way the rain comes and goes on that roof. Some drops are light, some storms are heavy, but the roof does not chase the rain. It simply receives it and lets it pass. This is the beginning of a very quiet but powerful discovery. The discovery that perhaps the mind is not something we must fight. Perhaps it is something we can observe. Modern psychology has begun to rediscover this insight. Researchers studying the brain have found that when we simply observe our thoughts without reacting to them, something remarkable happens. The brain begins to calm down. certain regions associated with stress and rumination become less active. In other words, observation changes the experience. But the Buddha discovered this long before neuroscience existed. He did not ask people to control the mind. He asked them to watch it, to sit quietly and notice a thought is present. Then a moment later, that thought has passed. Nothing mystical, just simple awareness. And when people began to do this, something extraordinary happened. They discovered that the mind had always been moving like a river, but the observer, the quiet awareness noticing the river, was never drowning in it. And perhaps the real turning point in understanding the mind begins with a question like this. If thoughts come and go on their own, maybe they were never truly you to begin with. So tonight, I want to leave you with a simple reflection. The next time a thought appears in your mind, instead of fighting it, just pause for a moment and ask yourself quietly, if this thought is speaking, who is the one listening? That question may open a door you never noticed before. Part 2. The Illusion of Control. Let us continue our reflection from where we left off. A moment ago, we explored a very small experiment, the white elephant, and in that tiny moment, many people quietly discovered something surprising. The mind does not always obey. Now I want to invite you to look a little deeper with me. For most of our lives, we carry a simple belief. We believe that we are the thinker. When a thought appears, we say, "My thought." When anger appears, we say, "I am angry." When fear appears, we say, "I am afraid." It feels so natural that we rarely question it. But let me ask you something gently. Have you ever noticed how thoughts sometimes arrive without invitation? You could be driving quietly down a familiar road, and suddenly a memory from 20 years ago appears. A conversation you had, a mistake you made, a moment you wish you could redo. You did not call that thought, you did not schedule it, and yet, there it is. Or perhaps you are sitting peacefully with a cup of tea, watching the afternoon sunlight move across the room. Then suddenly, worry appears. A worry about your health, a worry about your children, a worry about something that may never even happen. Again, you did not invite it. It simply arrived. Now let me share something that many psychologists and neuroscientists today are beginning to acknowledge. A large portion of our thoughts are spontaneous mental events. They arise automatically. They are not carefully produced by a central commander inside our head. They simply appear. Thoughts arise, emotions arise, impulses arise, and if you watch closely enough, they also disappear. But here is where suffering often begins. Because the moment a thought appears, we tend to identify with it. Instead of saying, "A thought of anger has appeared," we say, "I am angry." Instead of saying, "A fearful thought has arisen," we say, "I am afraid." It happens so quickly that we barely notice the shift. But this small shift creates an enormous difference. Because the moment we identify with every thought, we become prisoners of the mind. Now, what is fascinating is that the Buddha pointed to this very problem more than 2,500 years ago. In one of the earliest and most important teachings, known as the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, the Buddha invited his listeners to examine their own experience. He asked them to look carefully at everything they called self: the body, feelings, perceptions, thoughts, mental formations. And then he offered a very radical reflection. He said, "This is not mine. This is not me. This is not myself." Now at first, this teaching can sound unsettling, especially for people hearing it for the first time. But the Buddha was not trying to deny our experience. He was inviting us to look at it more honestly. Because if something truly belongs to you, shouldn't you be able to control it? If your thoughts were truly your possession, shouldn't you be able to decide exactly which ones appear? But the truth most of us eventually notice is much simpler. Thoughts appear like clouds. Emotions appear like weather. Impulses appear like waves. They rise, they move, and they fade. Many people who practice meditation for the first time are shocked by this discovery. They sit down, close their eyes, and suddenly the mind becomes very busy. Thought after thought, memory after memory, plans, regrets, fantasies. One student once told me after his first meditation retreat, "I didn't realize how loud my mind was until I tried to be quiet." Maybe you have had a similar experience. And this is where something very important begins to change. Because the moment you stop assuming you are the thinker, a new possibility appears. You begin to notice that thoughts are simply events in the mind, not commands, not identity, just events. In modern psychology, there's even a term for this shift. It is called cognitive diffusion. It means learning to see thoughts as thoughts, instead of truths, instead of identities. And when people learn this skill, something remarkable begins to happen. The mind loses some of its power to disturb. Anger may still arise, fear may still appear, but they are no longer absolute rulers of your inner world. They become experiences that pass through awareness, just like sounds passing through the air, just like clouds passing across the sky. You see, freedom does not come from eliminating thoughts. No human being has ever succeeded in doing that. Freedom begins when we stop believing that every thought defines who we are. And when that understanding begins to settle into the heart, life becomes just a little lighter, a little quieter, a little more spacious. So tonight, as you go about your day, or perhaps later as you sit quietly for a moment, I want to invite you to try a small experiment again. The next time a thought appears in your mind, instead of saying, "This is me," simply notice it and say softly, "A thought has appeared." Just that. No judgment, no struggle, just observation. And then watch what happens next. Because the moment you begin to see thoughts this way, a new kind of freedom quietly begins to grow. And I leave you with this question to carry with you today. If thoughts come and go on their own, who is the one that remains to notice them? Part 3. The Prison of Identification. Let me share something very human with you. Something almost everyone experiences, but very few people talk about openly. It usually happens late at night. You lie in bed, the lights are off, the house is quiet, and suddenly, your mind wakes up, not your body, your mind. Thoughts begin moving quickly. A memory from years ago appears. Something you said, something you wish you hadn't said. Then another voice arrives. What if you made the wrong decision? Then another one. What if something goes wrong tomorrow? And before you know it, you are no longer resting. You are inside the storm of your own thinking. Have you ever had a night like that? Many people have. In fact, one of the most common struggles people share today is something we call overthinking. The mind keeps replaying, reanalyzing, reimagining, and sometimes the thoughts feel so convincing that we believe every single one of them. But here is something important I want you to consider. The mind is a very creative storyteller. It produces thousands of thoughts every day. Some helpful, some harmless, some completely inaccurate. Yet suffering often begins in a very simple moment. The moment we start believing that every thought represents reality, or even more deeply, the moment we believe that every thought represents who we are. Think about anger for a moment. Anger can appear very suddenly. Perhaps someone says something unfair. Perhaps someone misunderstands you, and instantly a strong thought appears. They shouldn't treat me this way. Then another thought. This always happens to me. Then another. I can't stand this person. Within seconds, the mind builds a story, and before long we say, I am angry. But if we slow down and look carefully, something interesting becomes visible. The anger did not ask permission to arrive. It appeared. Then it grew, because more thoughts joined it. Thought after thought, story after story, until the mind created a powerful emotional wave. And if we are not careful, we begin to identify with the entire storm. Now let me share a sentence that I often reflect on myself. It is very simple, but very powerful. The mind speaks in thousands of voices. But suffering begins when you mistake one of them for yourself. Just think about that for a moment. Your mind has many voices. One voice says, "You're not good enough." Another voice says, "You should have done better." Another voice says, "You're too old to change now." But here is the question most people never ask. Who is the one hearing those voices? Because if you can hear a thought, that means the thought is not you. It is something appearing within your awareness. Modern psychology now recognizes this pattern as well. Researchers studying anxiety and depression have found that people often suffer not because they have difficult thoughts, but because they believe those thoughts completely. The mind says, "This situation will end badly." And we believe it. The mind says, "I am a failure." And we believe that too. But what if those thoughts were simply mental events? Temporary visitors passing through consciousness? In Buddhist teaching, this insight becomes very important, because suffering is not created by thoughts themselves. Suffering is created by attachment to thoughts, by clinging to them, by believing they define us. And when this identification becomes strong enough, the mind becomes something like a prison. Not a prison made of iron bars, but a prison made of beliefs. Beliefs about who we are, beliefs about our past, beliefs about our fears. Yet the moment you begin to observe the mind carefully, something extraordinary starts to happen. You begin to see the walls of that prison were never as solid as they appeared. They were built from thoughts. And thoughts, as we have already seen, come and go. So perhaps the real question is not, how do I stop thinking? But something much deeper. What happens when I stop believing every voice inside my mind? That is the reflection I want to leave with you today. Part 4. The Power of Observation. Up to this point, we have been looking at something very personal, the experience of thoughts appearing in the mind. But now I want to take a small step into another perspective. A perspective that may surprise you, because what the Buddha discovered through deep meditation more than 2,500 years ago, modern neuroscience is only now beginning to confirm. Let me explain this in a very simple way. Inside the brain, there is a network of regions that scientists call the default mode network. You can think of it as the brain's background thinking system. It becomes active when the mind begins wandering, when we start replaying memories, when we imagine the future, when we think about ourselves, our identity, our problems. In other words, this network becomes active when the mind is busy doing what many of us do all day long, thinking about me, my past, my future, my worries, my regrets. Now, this is not a problem by itself. The mind wandering is natural. But when this network becomes too active, something interesting happens. People begin to experience more rumination, more anxiety, more emotional looping. The same thoughts repeating again and again, like a song stuck on repeat. You may recognize that feeling. Perhaps you are driving somewhere, and suddenly you realize your mind has spent the last 10 minutes replaying a conversation from years ago, or worrying about something that has not even happened yet. This is the default mode network at work. The mind drifting, narrating, analyzing, remembering. Now here is where things become fascinating. Scientists at places like Harvard University and Yale began studying what happens in the brain when people practice mindfulness. Not complicated meditation, Just simple awareness. Observing thoughts, observing breathing, observing sensations in the body. And what they discovered was remarkable. When people simply observe their thoughts without reacting, the activity of the default mode network begins to decrease. The brain literally becomes quieter. The endless self-narration begins to soften. In some studies, experienced meditators showed significantly lower activity in the brain regions associated with rumination and self-referential thinking. In very simple terms, observation changes the brain. Now, when I first learned about this research, I remember smiling, because what modern science is discovering in laboratories, the Buddha discovered sitting quietly beneath a tree. He did not use brain scans, he used observation. He noticed that when we stop chasing every thought and simply watch the mind, something shifts. The mind slows down, space appears, and in that space, we begin to experience something we rarely notice in daily life. Silence, not the silence of an empty room, but the silence behind the thoughts, the silence that was always there, waiting to be noticed. One woman once shared with me that after a few weeks of practicing mindfulness, she had a strange realization. She said, "For the first time in years, I noticed the moment between my thoughts." Just a brief pause. A small gap, but in that tiny gap, there was peace. This is why observation is so powerful, because we are not trying to force the mind to stop thinking. We are simply changing our relationship with the thoughts. Instead of being swept away by the river, we sit on the riverbank and watch the water flow, and slowly, the river calms. The mind was never the enemy. It simply needed to be seen clearly. So perhaps the real transformation begins with something very simple. Not controlling the mind, not silencing it, just observing. And as you move through your day to day, I invite you to try a small experiment. The next time you notice your mind wandering, pause for a moment. Take one gentle breath, and simply watch the next thought that appears. No judgment, no resistance, just observation. Because the quiet miracle that scientists are now confirming and sages have long understood is this. The moment you begin to observe the mind itself begins to change. Part 5. Buddha's Radical Discovery. Let us slow down for a moment and step back in time. More than 25 centuries ago in northern India, there lived a man who spent many years asking one simple question. Why do human beings suffer so much? Not only physical suffering, but the quiet suffering of the mind. Worry, fear, regret, restlessness, things that follow us even when life seems comfortable. That man was Siddhartha Gautama, the one we now call the Buddha. What makes his discovery so remarkable is this. He did not solve this mystery through belief or through philosophy alone. He solved it through observation. Long before psychology, long before neuroscience, he simply sat down and watched his own mind, thoughts appearing, feelings appearing, memories appearing, and then fading away, again and again. Over time, he noticed something that most of us never stop long enough to see. Thoughts are not solid. They are events. They arise, they stay for a moment, then they pass. Just like waves on the surface of the ocean. And the Buddha realized something that was truly radical for his time. Freedom does not come from stopping thoughts. Freedom comes from seeing them clearly. In one of the most important teachings in Buddhist practice, known as the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha described a very simple approach. When a thought appears, you simply know it as a thought. Nothing more. Not my thought. Not who I am. Just a thought. Imagine how different life becomes when you practice this. A thought appears saying, I should have done better in the past. Instead of fighting it, instead of believing it completely, you simply notice a thought of regret has appeared. Then you watch and eventually it fades. Another thought appears. A thought of worry has appeared. Again, you observe. No struggle, no judgment, just awareness. You see, the Buddha discovered something subtle but powerful. The mind often traps us because we are inside the thoughts. But the moment we observe them, we step outside the storm. Let me give you a small image to reflect on. Imagine standing in the middle of a heavy rainstorm. Rain is falling everywhere. You cannot see clearly, you feel soaked. But then imagine stepping under a quiet shelter. The rain is still falling, but now you're simply watching it. The storm continues. Yet you are no longer overwhelmed by it. Observation is that shelter. And this is why mindfulness is not about controlling the mind. It is about changing your relationship to the mind. Modern psychology often describes this shift as moving from identification to awareness. Instead of being lost inside every thought, you become the one who notices, the one who witnesses. And once that shift begins, a very gentle freedom appears. Thoughts may still arise, but they no longer define you. They no longer imprison you. They simply come and go, like weather passing through the sky. So perhaps the Buddha's greatest discovery was not a complicated philosophy. It was something beautifully simple. You do not have to believe every thought. You only have to see it clearly. And today I leave you with a quiet reflection. The next time a thought appears in your mind, instead of asking, "Is this thought true?" try asking a different question. What happens if I simply observe it and let it pass? Part 6. The Sacred Gap. Up to this point, we have spoken about thoughts, about observation, about the wisdom the Buddha discovered through watching the mind. But now a very natural question appears. How do we actually practice this in daily life? Not in a meditation hall, not on a retreat, but in ordinary moments. When someone speaks harshly to us, when frustration rises, when the mind suddenly fills with anger, worry, or fear. Because that is where this wisdom truly matters. And here's something I would like to share with you. Something very simple, but deeply powerful. It takes only 3 seconds. Just 3. Many mindfulness teachers today describe this moment as the sacred gap, a small space between the event and our reaction. Most of the time we do not notice this space. Someone says something that hurts us, and the reaction comes immediately. Anger appears, words follow, the moment passes, and later we might regret what we said. But if you watch the mind carefully, something interesting becomes visible. Between the stimulus and the reaction, there is a very small opening, a quiet pause. That pause is where freedom lives. Let me show you a simple way to enter that space. You can remember it with 3 gentle steps. Stop, label, space. First, stop. The moment you notice a strong emotion rising, anger, irritation, anxiety, simply pause. 1 breath. Just a small interruption in the automatic reaction. Second, label. Instead of saying, "I am angry," try saying quietly in your mind, "Anger is present." Notice the difference. One sentence turns anger into identity. The other simply acknowledges an experience. You are no longer inside the emotion. You are observing it. Psychologists today actually use this same technique. They call it affect labeling. Studies have shown that when people name an emotion calmly, the emotional centers of the brain begin to settle. In other words, simply naming the feeling helps create distance. And this brings us to the 3rd step. Space. Once you have paused and gently named what is present, something subtle begins to happen. A small distance appears between you and the emotion. Anger may still be there, but now it is something you are watching, not something that controls you. In Buddhist language, this is the moment when awareness becomes larger than the emotion. The sky becomes larger than the storm. I once spoke with a man who practiced this during a difficult conversation with a colleague. He told me that he felt anger rising very quickly. His chest tightened. His thoughts began racing. Normally he would have reacted immediately, but this time he paused, just one breath. Then, quietly inside his mind, he said, "Anger is present." And in that moment, something changed. The anger did not disappear, but it softened, and because of that small space, he responded calmly instead of reacting. Later he told me something very simple. That pause saved the entire conversation. This is the quiet power of the sacred gap. It is not dramatic, it is not mystical, but it is profoundly liberating. Because the moment you create that tiny space, the mind loses its automatic grip, and in that space, a different kind of response becomes possible. Patience, understanding, wisdom. So the next time a strong emotion appears in your life, I invite you to try this. Stop. Take one breath. Then gently say to yourself, anger is present, fear is present, worry is present, and watch what happens, because the space you create in that moment is not just a pause, it is the doorway to freedom. And I leave you today with this quiet reflection. How different might our lives become if we learn to live inside that small sacred gap? Part 7. The ultimate realization. As we come to the final reflection together, I would like to return to something very simple, something you have probably seen many times in your life: the sky. If you have ever sat quietly on a porch in the early morning or watched the horizon in the late afternoon, you may have noticed how the sky is always changing. Sometimes there are bright blue skies. Sometimes soft clouds drift slowly across the horizon. Sometimes storms gather, dark clouds roll in, thunder appears, rain begins to fall. But no matter what the weather is doing, the sky itself remains unchanged. The clouds move, the wind moves, the storm comes, and then eventually it passes. But the sky was never harmed by the storm. The sky was always there. And in many ways, the mind works exactly the same way. Thoughts are like weather. Some thoughts are light and pleasant. Others are heavy. Some thoughts are joyful. Others are filled with worry or regret. Sometimes the mind becomes bright and clear. Sometimes it becomes cloudy and restless. But the great realization that mindfulness slowly reveals is that you are not the weather of the mind. You are the sky that holds it. The thoughts may move, but awareness remains. This is one of the deepest insights behind the practice of mindfulness. Not controlling the weather, not forcing the clouds away, but recognizing that the sky is always larger than whatever passes through it. Think about the storms you have experienced in your own life, moments of anger, moments of grief, moments when the mind felt overwhelmed with worry. At the time, those moments may have felt permanent, as if the storm would never end. But if you look back now, you can see something clearly. Every storm passed, every emotion changed, every difficult thought eventually faded. Yet something inside you remained present through all of it. The quiet awareness that noticed the experience. That awareness is what mindfulness gently brings us back to. You see, we often spend our lives trying to improve the weather of the mind. We want only pleasant thoughts, only calm emotions, only clear skies. But life does not work that way. Clouds will come, storms will come. That is simply the nature of the mind. But suffering begins when we believe the storm is who we are. Freedom begins when we recognize something deeper. Thoughts are weather. Awareness is the sky. The weather changes. The sky remains. This is the quiet essence of mindfulness. And when people begin to experience this directly, something very subtle shifts inside them. The mind becomes less frightening. Emotions become less overwhelming because they are no longer fighting the weather. They are resting in the sky. So the next time a difficult thought appears, or a heavy emotion passes through your mind, you might remember this simple image: a wide open sky, clouds moving slowly across it, And instead of trying to push the clouds away, just watch them drift. Because the moment you remember that you are the sky, not the storm, a very quiet peace begins to appear. And before we part today, I want to leave you with one final question to sit with gently. If your thoughts are only passing weather, what might your life feel like if you learned to rest in the sky instead?